called Journey to Christmas, where we are looking at the family tree of Jesus, because essentially the entire Old Testament is a manhunt for the Messiah. And we started off last week looking essentially at this first column of daily scripture readings, which, since today is December the 8th, if you were to start the reading today, you'd need to double up on at least two of these to do one a day from that point forward, and it would take you to Christmas Eve. So we looked last week at God's calling of Abraham out of Ur of the Chaldees, and telling Abraham to leave his country and his family and go to the land that he was going to show him. And God made several promises to Abraham, and these were unconditional promises. God, as God, can make an unconditional promise, and Abraham is just the recipient of it. He just needs to obey. And so God promises Abraham that he's going to give him the land that he's going to show him, that he's going to make his name great, that he's going to bless Abraham, and that he will curse those who curse Abraham, and that all the nations of the world will be blessed through Abraham's seed. And when he says that to Abraham, Abraham is then 65 years old, and he and his wife are childless. But nothing's impossible with God. Abraham believes God's promises, and he gets up and goes to the land that God is going to show him. So the first symbol last week was the nighttime starry sky, and you could use one star if you were making ornaments like this for your Christmas tree, and that's why we have the ornaments down here on the table. When I sit down in a minute, we'll pick up more. Why Abraham is normally represented with either a star or a group of stars, because God promised him descendants as numerous as the stars of the sky. And the night sky in Abraham's time, when you didn't have the light pollution that you have in the modern world, he would have been able to see the Milky Way. And so what we have here on the board is the name of the person, then the scriptural reference, and we're talking about the symbols as we go. And so last week we went through the first column, but when it came to the last three, Rachel and Joseph, I kind of dealt with them lightly, because everybody that's on this list is in Jesus's direct family tree, with the exception of Rachel, Joseph of Coat of Many Colors fame, and of course, Joseph, the husband of Mary, is not the biological father of Jesus. Rachel is not one of Jesus's ancestors in a direct line. Neither is Joseph, because Jesus is going to come from Abraham, from Isaac, from Jacob, and then from Jacob's son, Judah, not his son, Joseph. So Rachel and Joseph are not in the line of family tree, but they are important to the salvation story, and so we've included them. So now I'm going to go to the table here, and I'm going to pick up with, briefly, the symbol that we used last week for Jacob, which is Jacob's ladder, which you can see the Jacob's ladder reference in Genesis 28 there, because Jacob was on his way to his uncle Laban's house, away from, you might want to close that door at least, because we're getting a lot of noise from the folks out in the other parts of the church. Jacob was on his way to Laban's house. He's already lied to his father, claiming to be Esau, so he has stolen his brother's blessing. But the blessing is still valid. So Isaac is going to send Jacob to his own people, some of whom are still living in Syria, to get a wife for Jacob from the family and not from any of the local Canaanite girls. And while he was on the way to go to the place where his family was living, Jacob had to stop for the night. The place was formerly called Luz, and now he renames it Bethel, because as Jacob is laying there, he sees the vision of this ladder that reaches into heaven, and angels ascending and descending to and from heaven by means of that ladder. When Jacob gets to the place where his family is located at, he encounters Rachel, the younger of Laban's two daughters. And Rachel is represented by the number 7 because Jacob works out a deal with Uncle Laban. I'll work for you for 7 years in order to marry your younger daughter, Rachel. Laban agrees to it, but Laban deceives Jacob because Laban, nowhere in that 7-year time, does Laban tell Jacob the truth, which is that it's not our custom to marry off the younger daughter before the older daughter. No, he lets Jacob work for him for 7 years, and when the time comes for Jacob to claim his bride, Laban throws a party, gets Jacob highly intoxicated, but the girl that he sends to the tent, who is veiled, so Jacob does not see the face, and it's dark in the tent, candles haven't been invented yet, and electricity is a long way from being invented, and therefore, Jacob can't really see too well in the dark. Laban has sent in his older daughter, Leah. Jacob consummates the marriage, and it's only the next morning when it's daylight when he realizes, wait a minute, this is Leah, this is not Rachel. He runs to Laban and he says, what did you do to me? And Laban tells him, well, it's not our custom. Now he brings it up. 7 years he never said a word. Now he brings it up. But Laban also says, but if you'll work for me for another 7 years, I'll give you Rachel too. So Jacob had to work another 7 years to finally claim Rachel. So the symbol for Rachel is the number 7. Jacob and Rachel will be married, but Jacob is also married to Leah. Leah is having children. Every time she and Jacob come together, it seems like she produces a new child. She has Reuben, Simeon, Levi, and Judah. But Rachel doesn't have any children at all. Well, clearly, in this case, Jacob can't be having a fertility problem because he's produced sons through Leah. It's only when he's with Rachel that nothing happens. Rachel gets jealous and she borrows from the custom of the time, which would be to allow your servant girl, which is the girl's property, to be given to her husband as a concubine to raise up a family that would be Rachel's basically adoptive children. Because you see, they don't have adoption agencies like we have in our day and time, and they don't have in vitro fertilization and all those other kinds of scientific methods to help couples conceive. Rachel gives her servant girl, Bilhah, to Jacob, and sure enough, the servant girl gets pregnant and produces 2 more sons, Dan and Naphtali. Rachel then makes a statement that word gets to Leah on, that I'm in a wrestling match with my sister. That's why she's named Naphtali. Naphtali, it means wrestling. I'm in a wrestling match with my sister and I'm winning. Rachel's got some issues. Number 1, Leah has produced biologically 4 sons already. Rachel has biologically produced 0 children. The 2 children that are technically hers are her adopted sons through her maid's children, Dan and Naphtali. And when you're looking at the score, if it's 4-2 and you're the 2, you're not winning. But because Rachel makes this statement, and because it's now been a while since Leah has gotten pregnant again, Leah gets the idea that if my sister can do this and she just plans on keep giving that maid girl to Jacob to keep producing more children, well, I can play that game too. And so Leah gives her maid, Zilpah, to Jacob. And sure enough, Zilpah becomes pregnant with Gad and then Asher. So there are now many, many sons in the family and at least 1 daughter that Leah has also had. But Rachel's still childless. And they've been at Laban's house for now 20 years because Jacob served 7 years for Rachel and he got Leah instead. Then he served another 7 years to get Rachel. And then he had to work another 7 years to build up his own wealth through flocks and herds. And he's now ready to leave Uncle Laban behind and go back to his father's house. And by this time, he's got many, many sons. Rachel finally conceives, and she gives birth to Joseph, the coat of many colors fame, Joseph. And she named Joseph Joseph because the name means, may he add another. She's finally biologically become a mother, but she wasn't satisfied with just having a child of her own. She wants more. When it's time for Jacob to basically sneak away from Uncle Laban, he does consult with Leah and Rachel, his two wives. Leah's a good woman and goes just right along with it, but Rachel does something different. Rachel goes and steals her father's pagan idols that he's been worshiping, and she tucks them into her saddlebag. And off they flee from Syria, headed back to the Promised Land. Rachel's now pregnant again with that second child. She's going to give birth inside the Holy Land to son number 12, Benjamin, the last of Jacob's children. But she'll die immediately after Jacob's birth, because when Laban realizes that Jacob has left with his two daughters and with the flocks and herds that belong to Jacob, Laban chases after him because Laban is missing his household items. He falsely accuses Jacob of having taken them. They search everywhere, but they don't find them. Why? Because Rachel has tucked them in her saddlebag, and because she's pregnant, she's sitting on that saddlebag, and she uses the excuse of the manner of women is on me. So Jacob and Laban don't search there. She was sitting on those idols. Jacob clearly will not find those idols until after Rachel dies. Rachel is going to die in childbirth, and because she was the one he loved all along, Jacob now shows favoritism among all of his children. He's got children by Leah, he's got children by both of the servant girls, and he's got two children by Rachel, and he's doting on Rachel's boys above the other kids. That's why when he gives Joseph that coat of many colors, which is what this is represented by, Joseph becomes the target of his brother's jealousy. They know Daddy favors Joseph as Rachel's oldest boy more than he loves the other kids, that he's giving gifts to Joseph that he's not giving to anybody else. And they come up with a scheme to get rid of Joseph. When Joseph goes out into the field to check on his older brothers, to see how they're doing, they seize him. They get rid of that coat off of him. They throw him in a pit. At first, they're thinking they're going to kill him, but then they decide to sell him into slavery, but he's gone. And now they have to figure out, well, now what do we do with this coat? None of us can be seen wearing it. Dad had it specially made for his favorite son. So they come up with a very, very deceptive idea to make Jacob not want to go hunting for Joseph, to search for him to see what happened to him. They're going to make their father believe that their brother is dead. They all know better, but they're going to let their daddy believe for over 20 years that Joseph not only died, but that he died by a very brutal means. They're going to take that coat of many colors. They're going to shred it. They're going to kill one of the animals from their flock, and they're going to dip the coat in blood, and then when they go back home after they've finished pasturing the sheep, they're going to carry that now blood-soaked and the blood has coagulated, shredded robe to their father and say, we found this. Is this your son's? And even the way they say that, is this your son's robe? Not, is this our brother's robe? You see, they have emotionally distanced themselves from Joseph. And they're also somewhat emotionally distant from their father. to allow their dad to believe that one of his children has died, and has died by being brutally attacked and devoured by a wild animal, adds grief on top of grief on top of grief. And in the next 20 years, they will never reveal the secret. They're carrying that guilt with them, but they don't dare tell their father the truth. They'll implicate all 10 of the older brothers. Benjamin wouldn't have been there, he would have been too young. But they'll implicate all the older brothers in this conspiracy. And if Jacob learns that Joseph's alive, he wouldn't leave any stone unturned to go search for him. So they keep the lie, even though they watch their father wail and mourn and grieve for 20 years. So we have Joseph in slavery. The brothers think, we're rid of him. But they're having to live with the enormous guilt of what we did to our brother and what we did to our father. And they keep the secret, and the guilt gnaws away at them. In fact, it's going to gnaw away at one brother, Judah, so much that for a time, he's going to leave home. He can't bear to continue to hear his fathers crying and mourning and not being able to be comforted. Because he still has 11 sons, a daughter, but he doesn't have Joseph. And nothing can replace that loss in his heart. So for a time, Judah's going to leave home, and then ultimately he will return to his father's camp. But for a time, he can't live with his guilt and see his father suffer, but he also isn't going to tell Dad the truth. So when we're reading these scripture passages in preparation for Christmas, what we're seeing is how mankind behaves. Because we're in a fallen, broken world, we all have a sin nature, and we are in need of redemption. Jacob needed redemption. He had cheated his brother, lied to his father, and now his sons have lied to him and caused him to believe that one of his children is dead, and he's deprived of that son's company and companionship for 20 years. The next symbol for Joseph here is the cup, because you see 20 years pass. And Joseph has been blessed by God, even through the rough circumstances of being sold into slavery, then a little bit later on being falsely accused by Potiphar, who was the man he was working for, his wife, and thrown into prison. And God used even the bad circumstances that were in Joseph's life to get him into a position of leadership. Joseph will interpret Pharaoh's dreams that Pharaoh doesn't understand, because it's God revealing what's going to happen. That there's going to be 7 good years of great crops, and then there will be years of famine. And so Joseph advises Pharaoh to make sure you set aside some crops for the inevitable day when we don't have food, so that we'll continue to have something to eat. And sure enough, the famine comes. And the famine's not just in Egypt, it's up in Canaan too. And after a time, Jacob realizes, we need food. I've heard that there's food in Egypt. I've got money, but you can't eat money. You need bread. You need food. He sends his sons down to Egypt with the family's wealth. Go and buy food for us, because I've heard that they've got food in those storehouses in Egypt. The brothers show up. Joseph recognizes them, but they don't recognize him. He's been in Egypt for 20 years. He understands every word they're saying to each other, but he's only speaking to them through an interpreter, so that they don't know that this man who's sitting in front of them, who is the number 2 guy in all of Egypt, is the brother that they sold into slavery 20 years before. He provides grain for them, but he inquires. He wants to know, do you have a father? Do you have any other relatives? You see, Joseph has probably been wondering for the last 20 years. Yes, my brother sold me into slavery. But why hasn't my father come looking for me? All this time that I've been in Egypt, I've been separated from my family. Do they still exist? Have they passed away from age or disease? What's happened to them? But he never gave up on trusting in God's promises, even when he was a slave, even when he was falsely imprisoned, even when he rose to power and position in Egypt. Joseph didn't forget God, and that's an important life lesson for you and me as we're approaching the Christmas season, to look at these people who are in the family tree of Jesus and who have something to do with the Christmas story, to realize just how much all of mankind, which includes you and me, we need a Savior. Joseph continued to have faith in God in spite of the worst circumstances imaginable. When he gets the brothers to admit that, yes, the father's alive, Joseph now comes up with a plan. He wants to reunite with his father, and he wants to reunite with that younger brother who was a full brother to him, Benjamin. These are his half-brothers. Benjamin wasn't with them. Jacob, when he sent the older boys down to Egypt to buy food, refused to send Benjamin along because Benjamin's the only one of Rachel's boys left. And so he's clinging to it. So Joseph tells them, you need to leave one brother here as a security deposit to make sure you're telling the truth. You go back and you get your father and that brother you say you have, and you bring them down here to me, and I'll sell you more grain. But if you don't do that, you'll never purchase from this store again, essentially. The brothers go home. Simeon has been left behind as the security deposit. The brothers tell Jacob what happened. Jacob refuses to send Benjamin with them, and he's not ready to go to Egypt himself. They use up that grain. Time passes. It's still the famine. Jacob summons his sons and tells them, all right, we're running out of food here. You got to go back to Egypt and buy more food from that man. And the brothers remind him, we told you, Dad. The man said to us, unless we brought our younger brother back with us, he won't sell us any more grain. We could have gone and come back twice by now if you just let us go and take Benjamin. But he's still refusing to send Benjamin, and he's blaming his older sons now, saying that, all right, Joseph's gone. That would have been a beautiful opportunity for them to fess up, but they passed on it. And now Simeon's gone because Simeon is being held basically as a security deposit down in Egypt. And now you want to deprive me of Benjamin too. Reuben, the oldest son, will step up and tell his father, look, send Benjamin in my care. Trust me, Dad. If I don't bring him back, you can take and kill my two sons. Those boys would have been Jacob's grandchildren. What good would that do? And you see, the problem there with Reuben is he's offering to have somebody else pay the price if he doesn't come through for Dad. Jacob won't listen to him. But son number 4 by Leah, Judah, and that's our next Jesse tree reading, Judah in Genesis 37, verses 25 through 28. Judah steps up and says, trust me, Dad. I'll take him down there. I'll bring him back. If I don't bring him back, you can take my life. Judah is willing to take responsibility, real responsibility. Jacob reluctantly, when he realizes there's no other way and we're running out of food, reluctantly agrees. And all the brothers now take Benjamin with them. And when they show back up at the palace and they bring that brother, Jacob puts them to one more test. He wants to make sure their hearts have really changed and that they're not mistreating Benjamin like they mistreated him. And so he hides the cup in Benjamin's sack and then sends his men to go out and pursue. And when they realize that the cup has been found and it's in Benjamin's sack, and they go back, Now Judah steps up and he tells Joseph, but he doesn't know it's Joseph. He still just thinks this is the Egyptian viceroy. Let the boy go back to his father. I promised an oath to my father that I would secure his safety. Take me instead. Judah, in this instance, is acting like a substitute, a type of Christ. I'll be your slave. You can kill me, but set them free. That's what Jesus is going to do. He's going to come to earth as the baby. He's going to live a perfectly sinless life, and he's going to sacrifice himself to set you and me free. So Judah is acting like a type of Christ. When Joseph hears Judah making that kind of promise, let this boy go and take my life. Now Joseph reveals who he is to his brothers, and he tells them, there's more famine to come. Go get my father and go get your families, because his older brothers are now grown with families of their own. Bring all your flocks and your herds, bring your wives, your kids, bring my father, and come down to Egypt where I can take care of you. And so they do so. The family goes to Egypt, and they stay there. Jacob will die 17 years later after he's been in Egypt for quite a while. His sons will carry his body back, and they will bury him in the cave at Machpelah there in what we would call Hebron, where Abraham and Sarah have already been buried, where Jacob's parents, Isaac and Rebekah, have been buried, and where Jacob chose to bury Leah. When Rachel died in childbirth years before, Jacob and his family were in Bethlehem. Bethlehem is only a few miles from Hebron. But Jacob didn't carry Rachel to the family tomb to bury her there. He buried her right where she died in Bethlehem. I think, and this is Nancy thinking here, because we are not told this in Scripture one way or the other. I think the reason that Jacob did not carry his beloved Rachel to bury her in the family tomb is because after she died, I think he found those idols. And he realized that she hadn't fully given herself to the God of Israel. She was still clinging to the pagan idols that her father worshipped. So he buried her right where she died. But whenever it was Leah died, and we're not told when Leah died, whenever it was that Leah died, Jacob buried her in the family tomb at Hebron. And now he's going to be buried right beside Leah and along with his parents and his grandparents. They'll be in Egypt for a while. Joseph will pass away. They'll bury him in Egypt. Well, they'll put him in a coffin in Egypt and have him in a tomb there, but not like with earth covering him. Because when Joseph dies, he makes his remaining brothers swear that the day's going to come when God is going to fulfill all the promises he made to us through our father Jacob, our grandfather Isaac, and our great-grandfather Abraham. And when that day comes, and God carries us back to the land that he's promised us, don't leave my bones here in Egypt. Take my bones with you. Joseph will pass away. The people of Israel will stay in Egypt, and there will arise a Pharaoh who doesn't know Joseph. And that Pharaoh and the Egyptians will start to be jealous of the Israelites because they've got the best land and they're growing in population. And they allow an unfounded fear to get into their heads that maybe one day these people will turn against us. So they make slaves out of them. And they leave them as slaves for 400 years when it's God's timing. And God raises up Moses to lead the people out to the promised land. They've been in the promised land. They've gone through the period of the judges. It's now deep into the time where the judges are ruling. And there's another famine in the land. And one of the things that we know absolutely from the stories of Scripture is that when they first were getting ready to cross over into the Promised Land, Moses gathered the people together and he told them, you're about to cross over into that Promised Land. When you get there, if you will obey God, these are the blessings that God will give you. But if you disobey God, these are the curses that will come upon you. And one of the blessings was, if they were obedient to God, that they would have the right amount of rain at the right time of the year for their crops to grow so that they could have water to drink for themselves and their animals, water for their crops so that food will grow and they would be able to prosper. So now here we are deep into the period of the Judges, and we hear that there's a famine in God's land. What do we know? That the nation as a whole has been sinning against God. They've turned from being faithful followers of God to where they are worshiping other pagan entities, and God has kept his end of the bargain. You didn't obey me? There will be famine in the land. One family in particular, a family that was from Bethlehem. Bethlehem is where Rachel died in childbirth to Benjamin, but Bethlehem is in the territory that was given to Judah. And so this family is from the Judah family line. Man's name is Elimelech, which means God is my king. And he's married to a woman named Naomi, which means sweetness or pleasantness. And they have two sons, Mahlon and Chilion. Mahlon and Chilion's names mean sickly and puny. These boys weren't exactly the picture of health. There's famine in the land. The famine is so severe that Elimelech makes the decision to move his family out of Bethlehem and go across the Jordan River to the country of Moab. It's such a bad famine that he can't stay there because he can't provide food for his family, and none of his relatives and neighbors can help him either. So he's made the decision to move the family to a foreign land. And while they're in that foreign land, Elimelech is going to die. His sons are going to marry local Moabite girls. Then the two sons will die. And in the time that they've been in Moab, neither son and wife have had any children. Elimelech's widow, Naomi, hears that the famine is finally over with. She wants to go home, but she thinks she's going home empty. Because after all, when she left their family home in Bethlehem with her husband, they were an intact family. She had her husband and she had two sons. They moved to this foreign land. They've been there for a number of years. The boys got married. Elimelech dies, the boys die, and she doesn't have any grandchildren to cherish. All she's got are her two foreign daughters-in-law. The famine's over, but she thinks she's going home to a life of poverty, and she wants better than that for these daughters-in-law, so she encourages them to leave. One, Orpah, will obey her mother-in-law's wishes. And Naomi praises her for that. But the other girl, Ruth, absolutely refuses. She tells her mother-in-law, no, where you go, I'll go. She doesn't want her mother-in-law to go home and be without any family at all. I'll be your family. Where you go, I go. Where you lodge, in other words, where you live, I'll live. Where you die, there I will die and be buried. Ruth is making a lifetime commitment to her mother-in-law. And most importantly, Ruth tells Naomi, your people will be my people, and your God will be my God. Ruth is converting to the faith of her mother-in-law. Naomi and Ruth go home. When they go back home to Bethlehem, Naomi can go back to the old homestead, but there's still the practical matter. We've got to have food on the table. Ruth submits to the custom of the time and asks her mother-in-law for permission to go out into the fields, because in Israel, they set aside the corners of their properties, and they still planted crops there, and they allowed the poor and needy to just go and gather what food you want to from the corners of the field. So the symbol for Ruth here is wheat. If you wanted to do like a basket or a maybe open Christmas box, and you were looking for symbols to put in, you could put in anything that was made with bread. You could put in maybe a package of rolls or cookies, anything that's made with wheat to represent Ruth. The field that Ruth happens to go to, because sometimes God is working on our behalf in the rough circumstances of life, and because we're focusing on what's gone wrong, or we're focusing on our grief or our pain or our loss, we can't see when God's working on our behalf, but He is working on our behalf. Ruth gets up every day and she goes to the fields. The field that she landed in the very first day happened to belong to a fellow named Boaz, and he's our next symbol on the tree, because we're now in the book of Ruth. Boaz owns the field. The day that Ruth shows up and starts the work, Boaz shows up around lunchtime to check on his workers. He's got a foreman that he's placed in charge of that field. And when Boaz shows up in his field, he sees somebody. And it's been taught, misinterpreted by a lot of people over the years. When Boaz sees Ruth in the field, it's not like he goes, "Hey, what a pretty girl," though she is pretty. The name Ruth means Rose of Sharon. She is a beautiful girl. He's not looking for a date in the field. For one thing, he's described as an older man. Every time he talks to Ruth, he calls her daughter. He's a relative of her father-in-law, her late father-in-law, so he's probably one of Elimelech's brothers. Boaz sees this strange person in the middle of his field, not on the corner where the other poor people are at. And she's taking some of the best of his crops. It would be the equivalent of somebody walking into a store that they own and seeing somebody that they don't know helping themselves to the cash register. Boaz doesn't talk to Ruth at all. He calls his foreman, the guy he placed in charge. Who is that, and what is she doing in the center of the field? And it's the servant who's going to tell him, "Her name is Ruth. She came back with your kinswoman Naomi, and she asked for permission to be in the center of the field, and she's been working since sunup with hardly a break." And Boaz affirms what his foreman has done, because Boaz understands, okay, she's extended family, and so she's asked for permission to be in the center of the field and not over there in the corner with the poor people. I'll be responsible for her. And he'll call Ruth over, and he'll give her some of his lunch. He'll provide enough to where she can eat, and she'll also have some to kind of tuck into her cloak to carry home for her mother-in-law to eat. And he'll tell her, "It's good for you to be here. You stay with my girls day after day. Don't go to anybody else's field, because you might be harmed." Now that's something that should cause us to sit up and take notice. What do you mean? She needs to stay right there, because if she goes somewhere else, she might be harmed. Where is she? She's not in Moab. She's not in some other country. She's in God's land. She's among God's people. But human nature is human nature. Ruth has Target written all over her. She's with her mother-in-law. They don't have a male protector. She's foreign. She's poor. She's widowed, and they think she's barren. So she's an easy target for somebody who's in God's land but not really one of God's people, though they may be pretending to be God's people, to take advantage of. No, Boaz says, "You stay here every day with my people, and I'll see to it that you're protected. And at the end of both the wheat and the barley, 2 harvest seasons, Naomi comes up with the idea of, I'm not going to live forever. I'm getting on in years. Ruth, I need to provide for you. Here's what you do. You put on your best clothes, whatever they are, and Boaz will be out in the field tonight guarding the crops because the harvest has come in. You wait until he's had plenty to eat and drink, and you go and lay at his feet and wait for him to tell you what to do. Ruth is counting on Boaz to understand that she wants Boaz to take responsibility for Ruth, to care for Ruth as a family member long after Naomi's gone. Boaz will tell Ruth, I'll do everything you ask, but there's a problem here. There's one relative who has first rights to redeem the property and to take you into his home as a wife. If he'll do his duty, fine, let him do it. But if not, I'll do it. And Boaz goes the next day and meets up with that relative in front of the elders and tells them, hey, Naomi's selling Elimelech's fields. You have first right to buy it, and I'm next after you, so what do you want to do? And the man's ready to buy the field. And then Boaz tells him something that's within the spirit, but not the letter of the law. When you buy that field, you also have to acquire Ruth as your wife. You see, under the actual letter of the law, the person that the man would be acquiring as a wife would be Elimelech's widow, Naomi, not Ruth. Ruth's a generation down. But Naomi's already had sons that have died, and she's well past childbearing years. But the spirit of it is you redeem the property and then you raise up an heir for your late relative. Naomi is beyond normal childbearing years. Ruth is still young enough, though she's been married and they didn't have any kids when she and Mahlon were married. And then he passed away. The other man says, well, then I can't do it. It would complicate my estate. You do it. And so Boaz takes off the sandal. And so if you were putting an object under the tree, a flip-flop or sandal would do. Or if you're making an ornament, you could look for a picture of any kind of a shoe. This one, we drew a sandal, and that represents Boaz. Boaz has now legally acquired Ruth to be his wife. He will take her into his home. He and Ruth will conceive a child. That child will be Jesse. When we're looking at the promises that are in the Bible, the promise line goes from Abraham through Isaac, not Ishmael or any of the sons of Keturah, from Isaac to Jacob, not to Esau, from Jacob's 12 sons, Judah, not Joseph, not Benjamin, not Reuben, not Simeon, not Levi, but from Judah, the guy who was willing to say, I'll sacrifice myself to save my brother. From Judah's family, Boaz, who will be married to Ruth, who will produce Jesse. Jesse will have 8 sons, one of whom we are going to be familiar with years later. A shepherd boy, a warrior, a king, David. The family line is being narrowed down. And so that gets us to David. And the symbol for David in this one is a crown. It could be a shepherd's crook. You could even take, no, it's still there. Let me reach over here for a second. Behind our painting. We talked about this last week when I brought in a whole box of these to be shared for anybody at the church who wants them. And there's still some left, so not all the kids have discovered the location of the candy cane box yet. But the candy cane, and the reason you only see candy canes come out at this time of year is because it's this peppermint candy, but the rest of the time you'll see peppermint in either stick form or in round form, but it's shaped like a shepherd's crook when you hold it this way. And if you hold it this way, it's shaped like the letter J, and it's white and red. Well, white represents the purity, the red represents the blood, and you'll see big stripes and 3 thin stripes woven into the candy. The 3 stripes that are thin remind us of the whip, because you see Jesus is going to be descended from King David, the shepherd boy who becomes the king. Sometimes you may see a candy cane that'll have the red and white, and it may have 1 green stripe woven in as well to represent the new life and the growth. When it becomes springtime, what happens? The grass starts to turn from brown back to green. Plants start to bud out and have new life. Green represents life and growth. So sometimes you'll see a candy cane and it'll have a green stripe in there, but mostly you see them with just the red and the white. And that's a good opportunity for you to teach it to yourself, to your kids, the grandkids, whoever it is you've got that needs to know the story. And they need to know that Jesus is our good shepherd, but he's also our king. So the crown represents King David. David will have many sons, one of whom is Solomon, and Solomon is represented here by the gavel, a judge's gavel, because as he's ruling the people, Solomon prays and asks God, I'm so young, give me wisdom to rule the people well, and whenever people are bringing problems to Solomon to solve, he needs godly wisdom to lead the nation and solve the problems. So next week, we're going to continue and look at, once the kingdom is under David, then Solomon's son, Rehoboam. We're going to follow the family tree of Jesus until it gets us all the way down to a girl living in Nazareth who is descended from the tribe of Judah. She's also descended from King David through one of David's sons, Nathan. And she's going to be engaged to marry a man named Joseph, who is also from the tribe of Judah, who is also descended from King David. But Joseph is descended from the royal line that will be Solomon and Solomon's son Rehoboam and all of the kingly line. And while they're engaged, but they haven't yet consummated their marriage, the angel Gabriel is going to appear and tell Mary good news. The song, the first Noel means good news in French. The good news, Mary, is that God is going to make it come true, the promises he's made to Abraham, to Isaac, to Jacob, throughout all of history. God is going to provide the Messiah to save the people from their sins, and God has chosen you, Mary, to be the mother of that child. And teenage Mary's response is a response of faith. Let it be to me as you have said. You see, all these people with their good qualities and sometimes their shortcomings, they're people like you and me. And they go through good times and sometimes they go through tough times. And it's the choices you make that determine whether or not you will be able to follow God successfully. People like Joseph, who didn't let really bad circumstances that happened to them cause them to turn away from God. People like Ruth, who was born a Moabitess, but recognized that her culture didn't value human life. They actually sacrificed babies to pagan gods. She recognized the truth in her husband, Mahlon, and her mother-in-law, Naomi's religion, and she joined herself to the family of God. She made the choice to give her life to the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. You and I can make a choice. Are we really going to give our hearts to God? Are we going to follow God? Are we going to trust God? Are we going to worship God in good times and in bad times? Or are we going to let life circumstances turn us away? The choice is yours. Choose wisely. Next week, we'll follow the family line down through Jehoshaphat, Hezekiah, Josiah, and then the week closest to Christmas, we'll look at Joseph, the husband of Mary, and Mary, culminating with God came to earth. He took on flesh. That's the reason we have Christmas, the only reason we have Christmas, to celebrate Christ coming. But that he came with a purpose, to pay the sin penalty for us, to sacrifice himself on our behalf so that we could have eternal life and we could be with him. Thanks for watching.